So Hosea chapter 2, we left off verse 21. Yes, chapter 2. Wait a minute, we're not doing John on Sunday mornings, are we? I was going to say, oops, got the wrong notebook. No, Hosea chapter 2, we left off in verse 21. Previously, we had talked about this betrothal in verses 19 and 20, that it was going to be forever, that they were going to be betrothed in righteousness and justice, loving kindness and compassion, and that it was going to be in faithfulness. So we talked about the nature of this covenant, it being a marriage covenant, founded in choice and love, founding the nearest relation, being, coming back to me again. We might think back to verse 7, where it's saying there that she, talking about Gomer, talking about the nation, will go back to the first husband. And that the duration of the covenant, that betroth thee forever, that God's not going to break it on his part, but we can still break it on ours. We have the free will to do so. And I know that we've talked about free will before, and I was talking with someone, I might have been last Sunday evening, maybe Wednesday, I'm not sure, I've slept since then, regarding free will. And just to mention, one of the ways that I've always looked at it, we typically, when it comes to religion or religious arguments, we say, well, we either have free will or we don't, right? Calvinists, for example, will say, well, you don't have free will, God is sovereign, and so because God is sovereign, you do not have free will, and that's the end of it. And yes, God is sovereign. The Bible speaks clearly of that, especially in Isaiah chapter 6. But one of the ways that I've always looked at free will is the idea of why can't we have both? Right? Instead of either or, why can't we have both? I'll put it this way: we often, the writers, the New Testament writers, often speak of family relationships, and God is referred to as the Father who disciplines his children and things of that nature, right? And so if we continue to look at it that way, just consider our own births, right? We did not have a choice to be born. No one does. We did not have a choice to be born. That was a choice that was made outside of our control, okay? Just as man did not have a choice to be created. That was something outside of his control. But now that I'm here, now that you're here, you have free will to do as you will, right? And there are certain, as parents, we tell children, we tell grandchildren things that we want them to do, things that they should do. If they don't do them, then there can be punishment. If they do them, then there can be reward and whatnot. But they still have the free will to do it no matter what age they are. You can tell a 6-year-old, let's say, I need you to go around, I need you to pick up your toys. Well, sure, you as their parent or grandparent or caregiver, you have told them what you want them to do. But even at 6 years old, they have the free will to either do what you say and go around and pick up their toys, or to stomp their feet, fall on the floor, and start crying and screaming, right? So I've never really looked at free will as we have to have one or the other. That us having free will somehow takes away from the sovereignty of God. Or vice versa, is that certainly I did not ask to be created. None of us did. And it says, we're created in the image of God, and God is spirit, so we have that spirit of God. And that he knew us when we were being formed in the womb, David writes. And so that was outside of our control, but now that we're here, we have that free will. Does that make sense? To do as we want. So I've never seen it as it has to be one or the other. And maybe you disagree with that, and that's okay if you do. I wouldn't bind that on anybody. That's just how I've always looked at it, is that prior to my existence on this planet, I had no free will. I didn't exist, right? That's outside of my control. Then when I cease to exist on this planet, that too is outside of my control. You know, Hebrews 9:27, man's appointed to die once and then the judgment. So while I am here, I have that free will to do as I please, whether it's to worship and to follow Christ and this Christian path, or to not, right? But ultimately, it's going to be the result of my actions. I don't believe that takes away from God's sovereignty. And so this marriage covenant, I say all that to say that this marriage covenant that he is bringing them into, he says, I will betroth you, I will take you as my wife. Not you're taking me, I will take you as my wife. And it will be forever. So on my side, on God's side, I'm not going to break it. Okay? And that's not unlike any other covenant promise he made. Genesis chapter 12, where we have the Abrahamic covenant, you know, you leave your father's house, your kinsmen, go into the land that I'll show you, and so forth. He didn't break that one and brought about Christ through the Davidic line and what have you. Just as we know that he has made a promise to his people that they're faithful and they'll receive the crown of life, Revelation 2 and verse 10. So this is no different from that. It's not indicating that it cannot be broken. What it's indicating is that God will not break it on his side, right? And God has made that promise. So are there any questions or thoughts on that? And then we'll pick up in verse 21 where we left off. Yes, sir. Oh, Hosea chapter 2. I'm sorry. Hosea chapter 2. No, that's all right. Just there after Daniel. So verse 21, we'll go ahead and finish up this chapter, get through hopefully all of chapter 3. I mean, it's only 5 verses. We'll speed it along. So verse 21, it will come about in that day. Well, let me just back up to verse 20. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness then. Then you will know the Lord. And that then will come along in chapter 4 as to why they don't know now. But I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, then you will know the Lord. It will come about in that day, so in the day that they are betrothed in faithfulness, the day that they know the Lord, that I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. So back in verse 9, God has threatened that he would take away the corn and the wine. He says there, I will take back my grain at harvest time and my new wine in its season. I will also take away my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. So in verse 9, he threatens to take it all away. And then over here in verses 21 and 22, he promises to restore them. And remember, they were taken away because the people, they weren't recognizing God for his provision. They were saying that it was coming from surrounding nations. They were saying it was coming from the gods of those other nations. And they failed to give proper reverence and praise to God for it. So then in verse 23, he says, I'll sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. Very much, just in that first part of the verse, if you take notes, you might want to pencil in or write in your notepad or something, Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9 there. It's very similar. There it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourselves, not the result of works, lest anyone should boast. It is the gift of God, right? And so there he's saying, I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. She didn't do anything to deserve the compassion that I'm giving. But because I am a loving God, because I am a compassionate God, that is what I do. That is who I am. Right? And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. So if we're paying attention and looking at the text, it's very much we have a people that they have disassociated themselves from God in every way, which shows up at the beginning of chapter 4. But they've disassociated from God in every way. But God is talking of a time of salvation, of retribution, a time when He'll have compassion on the people again. And when that time comes, then they will be betrothed to God. He will take them in again, and He will call out to the heavens to bring forth rain, and the ground to bring forth grain, and what have you. And they will then say, "You are my God." All right, now, finding mercy with God, they're going to be restored to His favor and taken into this covenant again with Him. They had not obtained mercy, but seemed to be abandoned because they were not His people. They weren't distinguished. They not dealt with as my people. And because it didn't come right away, that punishment did not come right away when they first started straying from God. Then they thought that it was never coming. And let me see here. I'll come back to it. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Sure, there are definitely multiple applications for then, and Paul he would agree with that. When he says the things that were written aforetime or before, they were written for our learning. Because there are certainly applications, prophecies of the Old Testament, and no, absolutely, progressive prophecy. It is certainly a sound scriptural concept as long as it's applied appropriately. There's one doctrine in particular that misapplies a lot of it called the Max King doctrine, or it's more popularly known as the AD 70 theory, which is basically everything that Revelation talks about to include the coming of Christ. It happened with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and that the resurrection's already happened, and all of that type of stuff. But no, absolutely. What I was saying is, when they first left God, there were times in the Old Testament, for example, we know when punishment was immediate. Right? You think Leviticus 10 and Nadab and Abihu and offering that strange fire and gone. Or Uzzah touching the ark, gone. It was immediate. But a lot of the times when punishment doesn't come right away, people think that punishment is never coming. And so they keep doing, and that was the problem with them. And it's actually, and that concept is mentioned in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 11. In Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 11, it says, "Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil." Because God doesn't punish right away, because punishment doesn't come right away all the time. They thought it was never coming. And so they reached this particular point, and it was a matter of, okay, well, we'll just keep doing this and go in with Baal. And so they've separated themselves. He said he's going to bring this covenant back in. But this was the case with the rejected Jews. But to Miss Sherry's point on progressive prophecy, if we look over in Romans chapter 9, chapter 9 verses, let's see here. Oops. Bless you. If my pages will stop sticking together. This one is not a well-worn Bible. The well-worn is at home. It is quoted really over there in Romans chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. He says, and he says also in Hosea, I will call those people who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. And then it also talks about Isaiah there and what have you. So just affirming that the idea of progressive prophecy, and that yes, it does speak specifically to the Jews who had gone away, but it also speaks to the Gentiles as well, which we of course see come to fruition with Acts chapter 10 and Cornelius there. But people without hope, people without God in the world, but this great multitude of both Jews and Gentiles are going to be brought in. It's just not time for the Gentile people yet. And, we could discuss, it's really kind of outside of the scope to do it at any length, the idea that Gentiles, they had a sense of obedience to God, to the Jewish God. You think, for example, before the tribes are established, before the Hebrew tribes and Judah and what have you are established, you think Noah, for example, who was not part of that, and yet the first thing that he did when he got out of the ark was he made an altar and he offered an offering that was pleasing to God. Now, how would he know to do that unless God told them at some point how to do that? You think Cain and Abel and making their offerings. If you want to go even further back, how would they know what was pleasing unless God had told them at some point? So there was a sense of teaching before the Jewish nation was even formed, right? So God had mercy on those who had not obtained mercy and will. Those who found favor with God became children of his love, who had been long out of favor. And we could even consider that as the sinner who repents. And that long out of God's favor, they have a certain level of mercy of God in the sense that they are still living, they still have opportunity because he is long-suffering and what have you. And then upon their, repentance and confession and baptism and being added to the Lord's church, then there is this wide berth of mercy that comes. And they obtain God's favor and continue to do so as they remain faithful, just as we continue to receive God's mercy as we maintain our faithfulness. Any thoughts or comments on either progressive prophecy or this marriage covenant so far?
Even back in Genesis, when God told Adam that they could eat from all the fruit in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he said, for in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't die immediately.
Right.
So, I know there are a lot of, people on spiritual death or irreplaceable death.
Yeah, most tend to look at it as spiritual death because we know from the New Testament, from one man sin entered into the world, and that's kind of what it was talking about. But that also circles back to the idea of free will. Why why would God even put it there? Unless he wanted people to have a choice to obey or not to obey. You know? But no, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, chapter 3. Does anybody want to read this very extensive chapter? This very extensive 5 verses. Thank you. So Israel is a woman beloved of her friend, either of him that has married her or the one that courts her, and yet an adulteress. And that is the case, as we're reading here in Hosea chapter 3. That is the case between God and Israel. We say of those of affection, it's mutual, that there's no love lost between them and what have you. But here we find a great deal of the love, even of God himself, that has been lost. It's been thrown away by the people and they're unworthy, they're ungrateful for God's love. And the God of Israel, he retains his great love for his children, even upon the rejection of him. Very much like a parent, is that no matter how much you reject me, I will always love you. No matter how much you disobey, no matter how bad you might be, or if you want to say it that way, I will always love you. You're my child, right? And God is the same way, and yet they are an evil and adulterous generation. Right? God's goodness has not put an end to their evil, their badness, to put it that way. The Lord loves them, has a kindness for them, and he's continually showing kindness for them. They may not realize it, even though God has spoken in the previous chapter in verse 9, I'm going to take all of these things away from you. They still don't recognize God's love, because if God wanted to, he could obliterate them from the face of the earth, and no one would even remember their name. So even though there is punishment there for rejecting God, there is still love there. I remember growing up and, my dad, just whooping my tail sometimes. And he would tell me, I love you. This hurts me more than it hurts you. And just like the children of Israel, no, it does not hurt you more than it hurts me. Trust me, it hurts me plenty. No, you don't love me doing this to me. Right? So, but even though he's showing this kindness to them, there's no response from them at this point. They've completely rejected him. They look to other gods that they can see, and to the love that they're drawn to by the eye. They're not focused on spiritual things. Colossians 3, 1-3 says that we're to set our sights on those things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. They're not focused on that. They're focused on everything else. Right? Old Testament writer says, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God stands forever. They're focused on these material things, and they believe that these material things are brought about by these other nations, by these other gods, so that's who they turn to. That's who they offer their services to, their sacrifices to, and with an eye of dependence, they expect all of their comforts from them. And that's why God says, I'm going to remove those comforts, because you're not recognizing what it is that I gave you. Very much when they came out of Egypt, I know that we mentioned this at least last week, when they initially came out of Egypt from Pharaoh. At first it was God who led them out. And then Moses, he goes away, he's talking to God for a little bit, but they say that Moses is the one who brought them out. And then they all gather and they press in towards Aaron and they kind of push and kind of force him to make this golden calf. And next thing you know, they're praising this golden calf as the one that brought him out. The people are rife with it, and we can be the same way. We can be the same way, praising God for something one minute, and then the next minute not recognizing that we have what such and such because of God. Right? They're doing the same thing. They're just doing it on a greater scale than we are. If they were restrained from bowing the knee to idols, then there wouldn't have been an issue. But they had this full-on adultery against God. And in verse 2 it says, so I brought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley, or depending on your translation, what it may say in there. I courted her to be reconciled, you might say. To leave her ill courses, to return to her first husband, as we read about there in chapter 2 and verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. As the Levite went after his concubine, you might say, that played the harlot from him over in Judges chapter 19, who she had run away with another man there in Judges 19 and verse 3. But here, the present that the prophet brought her for the purchasing of her favor is observed to be a very small one. But it was all that was intended to separate for her for just maintenance, is just kind of the bare necessity, if you will. When Samson, for example, went to be reconciled to his wife that had disobliged him, he visited her with a kid over in Judges chapter 15. The prophet here visited his wife with 15 pieces of silver, a small sum, but she, Israel, has to be content to live with that a great while, so long as her husband is thought to restore her to that previous state. If I give you, if I'm pulling everything away from you, and then I just give it all back, you're going to go exactly to the way that you were before. And you're going to start praising these other gods and believing that these other gods gave it to you, these Baals, and you're going to be worshiping them. So I'm going to give you just enough for what you need. Just enough to make it. Paul, when he was writing, he said he had learned in all things to be content, right? And he taught, and of course in Corinthians he talks about love and what have you. We don't need an abundance of things. God, Peter says, has given us all things pertaining to life and godliness. So God is giving them enough that they need to survive, and not in squander, like in slums or anything. We're not talking about that. But enough to survive and still recognize Him, and not the abundance, not at this point anyways. So she's also to have a homer and a half of barley for bread corn, to be able to make, mill it down and make different breads and what have you. And after this kind of trial, the satisfactory proof given that they are reformed, then the abundance comes. I'm going to give you just enough as kind of a trial period to see if you're really going to rely on me. You know, Job, when he lost everything in the opening chapters of his book, or that book, we know that part of the reason is because Satan says to God, if you take everything away, he will curse you. It's kind of the same concept here, is that if you only get a little bit, are you going to curse God or are you going to praise God? And are you going to keep praising God if that's all you get? Then after this trial period, if you're found to be faithful, then you'll receive the abundance of things. Paul talked about pressing on toward the prize that he had not yet received, that prize that we're searching for. So we're kind of in a trial period too, to see if we're going to be faithful, to see if we're going to keep praising God. And if we do, upon our death, that's when the abundance of the promise comes. Right? Any questions or thoughts so far? Okay. So, she's going to be made sensible not because of her own merit or anything that she does, but the efforts that her husband makes. The price of a servant, for example, if we go back, yeah, we're not going to, we might, I don't know. I should need to just stop making promises. Back to Exodus chapter 21 and verse 32. This is talking about a servant now. It says, if an ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox will be stoned. That's in Exodus 21 and verse 32. Here, paid 15 shekels. Not even the price of a slave was how bad they were. And we'll see it even more when we get into the opening verses of chapter 4. Yet, even though it's 15 shekels, you know, back in Exodus 21, it was 30 shekels, that's it. And the ox is stoned. Here, it's 15 shekels, but it's also, you know, barley and a half or what have you. So it's, even though it's half as much, let her know that it's still more than she's worth. Right? It's like, even though I am paying for you for less than the cost of a slave, you need to know that you're so bad, it is still more than what you're worth. God, he had given Egypt for Israel's ransom once. We can look at it that way. So you had all of Egypt with the plagues, the ransom for his people, and yet here, 15 shekels, not even the cost of a slave. That's how far they had gone. Now they've gone. You know, Hosea says, you know, they've gone whoring from God, and he'll give them 15 pieces of silver, so much that they've lost their value by their iniquity. And that's something that we should think about in our own lives. You know me, I'm all about self-reflection and meditating on the Word of God and what we should be doing. How much does our value decrease by the sin that's in our lives? Right? We have to evaluate that. Because the problem with them is that they didn't evaluate it. They didn't stop to think, what are we doing? So it reaches this point to where they're completely gone away. You know, the prophet comes in and he says, you need to plead with your mother. You need to plead with the leadership and what have you. God says, you know, I'm going to take this away over in chapter 2 and verse 9, but then there's also the opportunity for salvation that's going to come. But I'm going to give you just enough to survive, to see if you come back to me, to rely. Now, God already knows. You know, God is omniscient. He knows everything. And then I said to her, verse 3, you shall stay with me for many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So I will also be toward you. So the new terms, God set some new terms here that he's willing to come with them. That they're going to stay with him for many days. They're not going to go to another person. Now, he could have given them rightly a bill of divorce in just, completely wiping them off the face of the planet and starting over. Right? You know, after the flood, God said he wouldn't destroy the world again by flood. But that doesn't mean that he can't destroy the world and just start over again whenever he wants to. So he could have very well done that. And so he could have given them this kind of bill of divorce, said, I'm not going to have anything else to do with them. And he deals not with them in strict judgment. That's the 5-minute bill. We still have 5 minutes. Strict judgment according to the rigor of the law, but according to the multitude of his mercies. Right? And it represents God's gracious dealings with mankind. And how he deals with us and how he works with us. That even though mankind as a whole has pretty much gone away from God, you know, he still keeps things, the world still keeps turning. You know, he's not willing that any man should suffer, but that all should come to repentance, right? But then we also read in Acts 17 in verses 30 and 31 that there is a time that the world will be judged by the one who is appointed, which is Christ, because he has given all judgment to Christ. Any thoughts or comments so far? Okay. We're going to try. So verse 4, the sons of Israel, they're going to remain many days without a king, prince, without sacrifice or a sacred pillar, without ephod or household idols. The word is used as concerning the pillars that Jacob erected in like Genesis 28 and other chapters. Remember, when something would happen, these pillars of stone would be erected, and it was so that when the children came and asked, what do these stones mean, then you could recount what it is that had happened, whether it was, crossing a river or land or what have you. And so they're going to be without that. The meaning is that there's no real face to this nation. They're not going to have sacrifices. They're not going to have pillars. We might put it this way: can you stand with God even if you don't have the outside symbolism, if you will? Can you still stand with God? If this house of worship were to burn down this afternoon, would we still have services tonight? That kind of idea. When you can't make your sacrifices, when you don't have your pillars to rely on, when you just have the bare necessity, are you still going to rely on God? That's kind of what he's telling them here. And we're going to do that for a trial period to see if you're faithful. You show your faithfulness, and I will open up the floodgates of abundance, as the Old Testament writer says. There are going to be so many blessings that your cup can't even hold it. The question is, can we remain faithful? It's always easier in a group. I've said it before, and y'all know this. It's common sense. It's easier for us to be Christians here on a Sunday morning when we're all meeting, we're all of a like mind, one body, one spirit, and what have you. Is it just as easy for you when you're out there in the world by yourself? And I'll admit, there are times it's not for me. There are just times it's not. And that's kind of what God is saying here. Will we still rely on him even if everything else were taken away? Like Job. Everything taken away. Oh, his wife, just curse God and die. I can, modern day, I could picture Job being like, woman, will you be quiet? And he said, but no, he just says, Old Testament style, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And he receives so much more abundance afterward. Any thoughts or comments? Okay. We'll finish up verse 4. Do verse 5, so that'll finish up the chapter. And then we will get into chapter 4. Chapter 4 has a lot of commentary, really, on the latter portion of chapter 2, especially chapter 2, where verse 6, people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. So maybe this week you might want to read chapter 2, might as well throw chapter 3, it's only 5 verses, and then chapter 4 as well. That's it. Dismissed.